I don't remember the music from that night, or the food, or half the faces that kept passing by. But I remember her. The way her laugh carried through the crowded room, not loud, but enough to make me look up. The way her dress caught the dim light, like it was made for it. The way, when our eyes finally met, I forgot what I'd been saying mid-sentence. She was older, not in the way people mean when they're trying to be polite, but in the way that feels like gravity. Like she'd lived enough to know exactly how to hold herself. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, a warm chestnut against pale skin that glowed even under the harsh party lights. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She just was. I don't think I spoke to anyone else after that. We didn't talk much at first. She was leaning against the kitchen counter, a half-empty glass of wine in her hand, when I worked up the nerve to walk over. I said something stupid. I think about the playlist, and she smiled without looking up, just enough for me to see the corner of her lip tilt, and said, "Is that your polite way of saying you hate it?" It should have been casual, but the way she looked at me when she finally lifted her eyes, like she'd already guessed every thought in my head, made my chest tighten. The night blurred after that. There was laughter, a brush of her hand against mine when I reached for the same bottle of water, the faintest shift in her body when I leaned a little closer to hear her. Little things that shouldn't have meant anything, but somehow did. And then, hours later, when most of the room had emptied and the music had faded into background noise, she found me again. "Take me home," she said, like it wasn't a question. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't think. I just followed her out into the night air, the kind that's cooler after hours of being trapped in heat and noise. The ride to her place was quiet, but not empty. Her perfume clung to the inside of my car, soft and warm, and I could feel the weight of her presence in the passenger seat, her arm resting loosely on the console, her fingers drumming once or twice before stilling. At one red light, I glanced over. She was looking straight ahead, but there was the smallest smile playing at her mouth. Not for me, not for anyone, just a thought she wasn't ready to share. By the time we pulled up to her place, my hands were shaking on the wheel. The house was dark except for a soft glow spilling out from the hallway window. She stepped out without waiting for me, her heels clicking against the pavement, and by the time I closed the car door, she was already at the front steps, keys in hand. I followed her up, my heartbeat too loud, the silence between us so thick it felt like its own language. When the lock clicked open, she stepped inside first. I hesitated at the door, just long enough to think maybe I'd imagined everything. Maybe this wasn't what it felt like. And then, without a word, she reached back, found my wrist, and pulled me in. The door shut behind me with a low thud, the kind of sound that leaves no room for second guesses. The house smelled like her. Something floral, something warm, and in the dim light, her silhouette moved through the hallway like a quiet invitation. She didn't look back, not at first, just walked slowly, deliberate, until halfway down the hall she paused, turned, met my eyes with that same calm, unreadable expression from the party. And then, the sound of her heels slipping against the hardwood cut through the silence, sharp and sudden, just enough to break the moment, to jolt us both back into reality. I froze, the words caught in my throat, as she steadied herself, one hand on the wall, her gaze still locked on mine. The sound of her heels still echoed in my head as I stepped further into the hallway, my pulse too quick, my hands unsure of where to be. She steadied herself, gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh, the first unpolished thing I'd heard from her all night, and said softly, "These floors, they've always hated these shoes." It wasn't much, but the warmth in her voice pulled me toward her before I even realized I was moving. The house was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from emptiness, but the kind that holds stories in its corners. Family photos lined the hallway, frames that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. A faint tick of an unseen clock. Somewhere deeper inside, the hum of an air vent that only made the silence sharper. "Sit," she said, gesturing toward the couch as she slipped her shoes off and padded barefoot into the kitchen. She poured 2 glasses of wine, her movements measured, practiced, but there was a heaviness in her shoulders that I hadn't noticed before. I sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped too tight, trying not to stare when she came back. She handed me a glass without meeting my eyes, then folded herself into the corner opposite me. The distance was small, but it felt like miles. For a while, we said nothing. The clink of glass on wood, the slow breath she let out when she finally leaned back. And then, almost to herself, she murmured, "I used to hate this house." I turned, surprised by the admission. She didn't look at me, just traced the rim of her glass with one fingertip. "My ex picked it," she said, her tone flat but careful, as if speaking too loud would wake something that had been sleeping. "He wanted the space, the yard, the neighbors." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "And then he left. Guess the house wasn't enough to keep him." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. And maybe that was the right answer, because after a beat, she finally looked up at me. Really looked. "You're quiet," she said. "That's unusual." I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Maybe I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," she said, softer now. "Sometimes quiet is enough." The way she said it, almost a confession, made something twist in my chest. I wanted to move closer, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I watched her, the way her hair caught the lamplight, the faint line of tension between her brows, the way her hand gripped the stem of her glass just a little too tightly. And I realized, suddenly, that she wasn't just confident. She was lonely. The kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself but hangs around, settling in the spaces no one else sees. When she spoke again, her voice had that same quiet weight. "This, whatever this is, it's not simple, you know." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Because of the age thing?" Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Among other things." She turned her glass slowly in her hands. "People talk. They always do. And you're young. You think you know what you want, but I know what I want," I said, sharper than I meant to. That made her look at me. Really look, her eyes searching mine for a long, unbroken moment. Something unspoken passed between us. Not a promise, not quite permission, but a shift. She broke the stare first, setting her glass down carefully, like she needed her hands to be doing something. "You shouldn't," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. The room felt smaller then, the space between us charged. I could hear her breathing, steady, but deeper now. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and for a second, the distance between us was nothing. I could have kissed her. God, I wanted to. But instead, she reached out, her hand brushing lightly over mine. A touch so brief I almost thought I imagined it. Almost. I looked down at our hands, then back up. She didn't move away, didn't apologize. She just sat there, her gaze locked on mine, like she was daring me to decide what happened next. The air between us felt heavier after that night. I told myself I wouldn't think about it. The way her hand had lingered on mine, the way her voice had dropped when she said, "You shouldn't." But every time I closed my eyes, it came back. Her gaze, steady and unreadable, as if she'd handed me the choice and dared me to take it. I didn't. Not then. But I wanted to. A week later, I was at her house again, under the pretense of fixing something with her Wi-Fi. She'd texted me casually, like it was nothing. Like she didn't know I'd been replaying that moment over and over. The house smelled the same. Warm, faintly floral. And I felt the same low thrum in my chest the moment I stepped in. She was barefoot again, her hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck, an oversized sweater falling just low enough to make my throat tighten. "Routers in the study," she said, her voice even, almost clipped, like keeping a line between us required effort now. I nodded and followed her, careful to keep a safe distance, though every step made it harder to pretend I didn't want to reach out to close that space. The study was small, quiet, the hum of the ceiling fan cutting through the silence. I crouched near the router, fiddling with the cables, trying to focus on anything but the way she leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching me. "You know," she said after a moment, "I could have just called someone." I glanced up, a half-smile tugging at my mouth. "Yeah, but then you'd have to let a stranger in." She tilted her head slightly, almost amused. "And you're not a stranger?" I wanted to answer, to say no, not anymore, but my phone buzzed in my pocket, sharp and loud in the quiet room. I pulled it out, glancing at the screen. a friend's name flashing with a simple text. Where are you? Before I could silence it, she'd stepped closer, close enough that I caught her perfume, close enough that when I looked up, she was standing right there, her shoulder brushing the doorframe, her eyes on the phone in my hand. Busy night? She asked, her tone light, but her gaze steady. I shook my head quickly. No, just someone checking in. Her lips curved, but there was something unreadable in the expression. Curiosity, maybe, or something sharper. The moment stretched. Her fingers brushed the edge of the desk, then lingered, drumming softly against the wood, a quiet rhythm that matched the pounding in my chest. I stood, too fast, and almost stumbled. She didn't move, didn't step back, and suddenly, the room felt too small, the space between us too charged. You fixed it? She asked, her voice softer now. Yeah, I said, though I barely remembered what I'd done. She nodded slowly, but she didn't look away. Her eyes locked on mine, holding me there, like she was waiting for me to do something or for herself to decide if she'd let me. I could feel the words rising, the ones I'd bitten back for days. I think about you. I can't stop. I don't care what anyone says. But then, from the hallway, the sharp chime of her phone broke the moment, echoing through the house like a warning bell. She blinked first, stepping back, the tension snapping like a wire pulled too tight. I should get that, she said, almost too quickly. I nodded, my hands curling into fists to keep from reaching for her. She turned, her sweater shifting just enough to reveal the soft line of her shoulder before she disappeared down the hallway, leaving me standing there, my pulse still hammering. I should have left. That would have been the smart thing. But I stayed, waiting, listening to the faint murmur of her voice as she answered whoever was on the line. Minutes later, she returned, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, God, her eyes, softer now, almost resigned. I shouldn't have asked you to come, she said quietly. Then why did you? Her breath caught, the faintest hitch, and for a moment, she didn't answer. Then, so softly I almost didn't hear it. Because you show up. She didn't look at me when she said it. She just moved past me, close enough that her sleeve brushed my arm, close enough that I caught the warmth of her skin through the thin knit. And in that fleeting, electric second, I knew two things. I wasn't going to stay away. And neither was she. I told myself I wouldn't go back. That night in the study had been a warning. The way she looked at me, the way her voice trembled when she said I shouldn't have come. But then she texted, "Can you help me with something?" No explanation. Just that. And like a fool, I went. It was late, later than it should have been, when I pulled into her driveway. The house was dark except for the glow spilling from the living room. She opened the door before I even knocked, her sweater sleeves pulled down over her hands, her hair falling loose like she hadn't planned for company. "You came," she said, quiet, almost surprised. "You asked." I answered, my voice rougher than I meant. Inside, the room was warm, dim, shadows stretching across the walls. She'd opened a bottle of wine, half of it already gone, and 2 glasses sat waiting on the coffee table. I didn't ask if she'd been expecting me. We sat, her on one end of the couch, me on the other, and for a while, it was nothing but the soft hum of music from the corner speaker and the clink of glass against wood. And then she looked at me. Really looked. "Why do you keep showing up?" she asked. I opened my mouth, closed it again. Because the truth, because it's you, felt too raw to say out loud. She didn't wait for me to answer. "You shouldn't," she said, but her voice wasn't steady. "This, whatever this is, it's not fair. To you, to me, to anyone." "Then tell me to stop," I said, leaning forward now, elbows on my knees. "Look me in the eye and tell me you don't want this, and I'll walk out that door." She froze. Her breath hitched, her knuckles tightening around the stem of her glass. But she didn't tell me to go. The silence stretched, sharp and thin, until she whispered, "I can't." Something in me broke then, the last thin thread of restraint snapping clean. I moved before I even thought, closing the space between us, my hand catching hers, my voice low, right near her ear. "Then stop pretending you don't feel it," I murmured. She flinched, not away from me, but closer, just enough that I could feel the heat of her shoulder against mine. the soft brush of her hair against my jaw. "This is a mistake," she breathed, but there was no conviction in it, only fear. "Then let it be," I said. Her eyes fluttered shut, just for a second, and I saw it. The way her guard wavered, the way the fight drained from her shoulders. I lifted a hand, slow enough to give her time to pull away, and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. My fingers grazed her cheek, warm and soft, and she didn't move. "You don't know what you're asking for," she whispered, her voice breaking on the edges. "Then tell me," I said. "Teach me. Whatever this is, whatever you're afraid of, just don't shut me out." Her breath caught, sharp and shallow. The room felt too quiet, too still, every sound amplified. The faint tick of the clock, the low hum of music, the uneven rhythm of her breathing. And then she leaned in, just barely, so close that I could feel the warmth of her against me, could smell the faint sweetness of her perfume. My heart slammed against my ribs, every nerve ending wired tight, waiting. "Say it," she whispered, her lips so close I could almost taste the word. I swallowed hard, my voice low and rough. "I want you." She exhaled, shaky, like she'd been holding her breath for days. Her eyes lifted to mine, wide and searching, and for one suspended second, the world narrowed to nothing but her. The curve of her mouth, the way her pulse fluttered at her throat, the quiet surrender in her gaze. I tilted forward, closing the last inch of space, my lips a breath away from hers. And then, sharp and jarring, the front door creaked open. A voice, muffled but close. "Hello? You here?" She froze, eyes wide, panic flashing across her face. My chest tightened, every muscle wound tight as we sat there, caught. The air between us still humming with everything we hadn't said. The voice from the doorway froze us both. She jerked back, almost violently, like the few inches between us weren't enough to erase what had just happened. Her sweater brushed my knee as she shot up from the couch, smoothing her hair, her movements too fast, too sharp to look natural. "Mom." The voice came again, closer this time, footsteps crossing the entryway. My stomach dropped. Her son. I hadn't even known he was in town. By the time he stepped into the living room, her face was composed, calm, even, but her hands betrayed her, knuckles white where they clutched the edge of the counter. "Oh," he said, pausing when he saw me, his eyes narrowing with quiet curiosity. "Didn't know you had company." She forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "He was just helping me with something," she said, her voice steady, practiced. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering, and managed a nod. "Yeah, Wi-Fi stuff." Again, his gaze lingered on me for a beat too long before he shrugged and disappeared down the hall, his footsteps fading until the soft click of a bedroom door broke the silence. The quiet that followed was deafening. She didn't look at me. Not right away. She stood there, one hand pressed flat against the counter, her shoulders tight, her breath shallow, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and sharp. "You need to go." I stared at her, the words catching in my throat. "Is that really what you want?" Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing with something I couldn't name. Fear, anger, desire. Maybe all of it. "What I want," she said, her voice trembling now, "doesn't matter. Not anymore." I took a step toward her, then another, until I was close enough to see the fine tremor in her hands, the uneven rise and fall of her chest. "It does to me," I said softly. For a moment, I thought she'd push me away. But instead, she turned, her back to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand," she said. "If he even suspects, if anyone finds out," her breath hitched, and she pressed a hand to her forehead like she could push the thought away. "It'll ruin everything." I hesitated, my hands clenched at my sides, because she was right. Whatever this was, whatever we were, it wasn't just complicated anymore. It was dangerous. But even then, even with fear written all over her face, I couldn't stop wanting her. "Then tell me to stay away," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Tell me to stop coming here, and I will." She didn't answer, didn't move. I stepped closer, close enough that the warmth of her back brushed my chest, close enough that I could see the way her hair trembled slightly where it fell against her shoulder. "You can't," I whispered, and it wasn't a question. Her hand tightened against the counter, her knuckles white, but she didn't pull away when I lifted my hand, letting my fingers ghost over her wrist, not holding, just there. "This isn't fair," she breathed, her voice breaking. "Maybe not," I murmured, "but it's real." Something in her gave then. A quiet exhale, a soft shudder, and before I could think better of it, she turned, her shoulder brushing mine, her eyes wide and wet and impossibly vulnerable. "I don't know how to stop," she whispered. And that was it. The shift. The line we both knew we couldn't uncross. Because in that moment, with her so close I could feel her breath on my skin, with the sharp ache of everything we'd been holding back crackling in the space between us, it didn't matter who was down the hall, or what it would cost, or how impossible this had become. It only mattered that she'd finally said it. And I wasn't going to let her take it back. The house was silent again. Too silent. Her son's door had stayed shut for an hour, maybe longer, and in that time neither of us had moved far from where we'd frozen. She stood near the counter, one hand gripping the edge like it was the only thing holding her up. I stayed in the doorway, restless, my pulse still pounding from everything that hadn't happened, everything that almost had. I should have left. I knew that. But every time I looked at her, the way her shoulders were drawn tight, the way her chest rose and fell like she was fighting her own breath, I couldn't make myself walk out that door. Finally, she spoke. "You should go," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I stepped closer. "Do you want me to?" Her silence was answer enough. Another step. My shoes barely made a sound on the hardwood, but she heard it. I saw her flinch, just slightly, like she was bracing herself. When I reached her, the distance between us was no more than an arm's length. "You can't keep showing up," she murmured. "Not like this. Not when what?" I cut in, my voice low. "When you feel the same way I do." Her eyes snapped up to mine, sharp, almost accusing, but there was no denial in them. No fight left. "You think this is simple," she said, her voice shaking now. "You think it's just wanting." "It's not," I said, softer now. "It's you." Something broke in her then. I saw it in the way her posture faltered, in the way her hand slipped from the counter, trembling as it hovered uselessly at her side. I closed the last inch between us, slow, careful, like any sudden move might send her running. My hand lifted, brushing the loose strands of hair from her face. My fingers lingered, skimming the warm edge of her jaw, and I felt her lean into it. Just barely, just enough. "This will ruin me," she breathed. "No," I whispered. "This will save me." Her breath hitched, sharp, and for a moment neither of us moved. The air between us was thick, alive, every unspoken word pressing in from all sides. Then, with a shaky exhale, she stepped closer, until her forehead was nearly against mine. "Tell me," she whispered, "that you'll walk away if I ask you to." I swallowed hard, my chest tight. "I can't." Her eyes closed, and when they opened again, there was no more hesitation, no more shield. Just her, raw, exposed, and looking at me like she'd been drowning and had finally stopped fighting the water. "Then don't," she said. And that was it. My hand slid to the back of her neck, my thumb brushing the soft edge of her hairline, and she didn't flinch. She leaned into me, every line of her body trembling, and for one breathless second we just stayed there, suspended, everything else falling away. The world narrowed to the quiet hum of the house, to the faint rhythm of her pulse against my palm, to the way her breath caught when I tilted closer. "You," I murmured, so softly it barely counted as a word. She exhaled, shaky, and then she was there, closing the last space between us, her forehead resting against mine, her hands twisting in the fabric of my shirt like she was anchoring herself. No words, no explanations, just the quiet, messy surrender of two people who'd fought too hard against something they were never going to win. When we finally pulled back, just enough to see each other, there was no fear left. No pretending. Her voice was soft, unsteady, but sure. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." And I knew, in that moment, no matter what it cost, no matter what lines we'd crossed, We'd made the choice neither of us could take back. This was it. Her. Me. And finally, no distance left between us. The house was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel suffocating. Not anymore. She sat beside me on the couch, her knees drawn up, her sweater sleeves pulled over her hands like she was still trying to make herself smaller. I could still feel the warmth of her pressed against me, the ghost of her whispered, "Don't," lingering in my chest. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There wasn't anything left to argue about, nothing left to deny. It was just us. The hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the faint tick of the clock on the wall, her breathing soft and steady beside me. I turned my hand, palm up, slow and careful, until my fingers brushed hers. She hesitated, just for a second, then slid her hand into mine. Her skin was warm, her grip tentative but certain. "You're shaking," I said softly. "I know." Her laugh was small, almost fragile, but real. "I've been holding my breath for weeks." I turned to look at her. And now, she met my eyes, and for the first time, there was no wall there. No fear, just her. Now, I think I can finally breathe. Something tight in my chest eased at that. I shifted closer, our knees touching, and reached up to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. My fingers lingered against her cheek, and she leaned into the touch, closing her eyes like it was the first time she'd let herself rest. "You know they're going to talk," she said quietly. "Let them," I murmured. "They don't know you. They don't know me. And they don't know this." Her lips trembled with something that might have been relief. "You're too young to know what forever feels like." "Maybe," I said, my thumb brushing the edge of her jaw. "But I know what this feels like. And I'm not walking away." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was soft. Safe. She shifted closer, her head finding the space between my shoulder and neck like it had always belonged there. My arm wrapped around her almost instinctively, holding her tighter than I meant to. For the first time, she didn't pull away. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, the world outside shrinking until there was nothing but the steady rhythm of her breathing and the quiet certainty settling between us. At some point, she tilted her face up, just enough that I could press my lips to her forehead, a slow, steady kiss that said everything words couldn't. She closed her eyes, a soft sound escaping her, and I felt her hand tighten around mine, her fingers threading between mine like they'd always belonged there. "This is terrifying," she whispered. I smiled, pressing my cheek to her hair. "Yeah, but it's ours." Her breath caught, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something lighter, something almost like hope. And for the first time since the night at the party, since that first electric glance across the room, I felt it too. Not just the pull of her, or the ache of wanting, but the quiet, steady truth that whatever happened next, we'd chosen this. Each other. When the night finally gave way to morning, neither of us moved. The first light crept through the curtains, pale and soft, and she was still there, her hand in mine, her head against my shoulder. And I knew, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, we'd stopped running. And we weren't going back. Did you enjoy the story? What kind of stories would you like to hear next?